Today, we're going to be speaking with Chris Finan, who's the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship and also author of the book, How Free Speech Saved Democracy. Chris, really great having you on. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you having me.
You know, we've had conversations about the First Amendment that were very legally oriented, and we've had those often with law professors and others. One of the interesting things about your book is that you delve more into the history of when the suppression of speech and the fight for free speech were, you contextualize it in history in some interesting ways. And one of the things you point to, just to start somewhere, and we could start anywhere, you talk about war as being one of the big culprits used by governments to suppress free speech. And I think that won't come as a huge shock to many in our audience when we understand the idea of, for the purposes of supporting the troops, for national security, whatever, don't say this or say that. That I think will make sense. But can you talk about some of the examples of when war was used in this way?
Sure, because actually World War One was civil liberties meltdown in this country and actually precipitated lawyers for the first time to start thinking about using the First Amendment to protect speech that the government might not agree with. You know, the Sedition Act and passed by Congress at the behest of President Wilson actually provided prison sentences of up to 10 years for people who spoke out against the war, and it was ultimately used to prosecute over 2,000 Americans, some for the most inane kinds of criticisms like Wilson is a blockhead, or people who circulated petitions. You know, today what we would say is the most frequent forms of speech were suppressed, and people were sent to jail. Over 1,000 people were sent to jail. Many lives were ruined, and it was against that background that the ACLU was formed in 1920 and began to fight. And of course, you know, in subsequent wars, we would see similar efforts at suppression, certainly during the Vietnam War.
What modern administration, and we can include the Vietnam War era in that, I mean, you know, in the last 80 or so years, was most harmful, I guess is the word I would use when it comes to suppression of speech? Is there a clear administration, I guess?
Well, yeah, Wilson clearly stands out because there was so little law actually on the First Amendment before the 20th century. And there had been a whole century before, and go all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Acts, right at the turn of the 18th century into the 19th. Newspaper editors were thrown into jail for criticizing the administration of John Adams, so there was very little law on First Amendment rights before World War One. So, and then, you know, there were certainly efforts during the Nixon administration around the Pentagon Papers, efforts to suppress,
right,
that very critical study of the Vietnam War. Daniel Ellsberg was actually indicted for sharing that with the New York Times and the Washington Post, and might well have gone to jail if the Supreme Court hadn't stepped in and said that was protected speech.
Are you surprised, or I guess what do you make of how the American right wing recently has very proactively claimed free speech as one of its core tenets, despite sort of not only having a shaky history on the subject in the past, but even while claiming that as one of its tenets, you know, talking about Trump wants to jail flag burners or open up libel laws, which basically is code for make it easier to sue newspapers and media outlets for doing journalism. Is it surprising historically that you would see that seeming conflict? And what else do you sort of think about that?
Well, it's wildly ironic.
Yeah.
It's wildly ironic to hear conservatives advocating as defenders of free speech when over the course of American history they have been the major violators of that freedom because they've often been in the majority, and the people who have been advocating for free speech have been people fighting for equal rights, and that was something that they opposed. And this goes back to the abolitionists and to the women's rights activists and activists for sexual freedom. They have at every turn, conservatives have tried to suppress their speech, and right through the civil rights movement, of course, and into the modern era. And as you say, Donald Trump was a big, waved the big stick against the press, called the press the enemy of the people. So yes, to suddenly see conservatives advocating, for free speech rights is ironic and also difficult for us because it alienates our traditional base, which is young people and liberals and progressives who have been part of those equal rights fights.
There are many accusations hurled at the left about suppressing speech, including different types of alleged censorship on college campuses, both when it comes to alleged lack of political diversity among faculty, but also as it pertains to invited speakers to college campuses has become a very big kind of flashpoint. To some degree, along the lines of LGBT discussions, most recently when it comes to trans rights, the right will sometimes hurl allegations at the left. What do you think is the biggest area of concern on the left when it comes to stifling free speech?
Well, I think, and that again is, a change in the political climate around free speech. I think that it's understandable in a world that's suffused now with misinformation and hate speech that people, progressives, have sometimes tried to suppress speech themselves. And we are concerned about those efforts on campus. And we are concerned about, we certainly support the right to protest speakers on campus and to present the other view. But we really think it's a mistake to try to suppress them, because then conservatives just turn around and point to that as justification for the suppression that they wanted.
Right. Yeah, my view on this has been, an unsavory guest is invited to a campus, someone I'm not interested in seeing. Fine. If they have been properly invited and there's no criminal issue and whatever else, certainly there's nothing wrong with the invitation and the fact that they have an event. Protesting outside the event, absolutely fine with it. The protesters shouldn't be restricted to some pen a block and a half away where nobody sees that. Absolutely fine. Once the event starts, it does seem to me that it's correct to allow the speaker to speak, and then you can continue expressing your displeasure during a Q&A, for example. The counterpoint will be, well, there might be no Q&A, so your only opportunity is while the speaker is speaking. Or I understand that it starts to get to one of these things of, well, the protests can't only be the way everybody's comfortable. Part of protesting historically is sometimes the protests happen in a way and at a time and in a place where it is an imposition on someone else. But fundamentally, I do think that preventing the speaker from speaking is a mistake.
Yeah, and I think it also applies to trying to revoke invitations that have been made to speakers. If there are people on campus who want to hear that speaker, they should have the right to hear them. But by the same token, those who don't have an absolute right to protest. But we don't want to say free speech only for our side, which is really what the conservatives are saying. It is free speech for us and not for you, because then that lays the groundwork for what we are seeing now around the country, which is these hundreds of challenges to books in schools and libraries that progressives care deeply about. These are books about race and the persistence of racism in America, and how to look at slavery, and the lives of LGBT people, and their right to be represented in school libraries, and so we have to protect. This is the classic statement. We have to protect the rights of all in order to ensure that everybody has rights.
When it comes to the book banning, the truth as I have researched it is that the right is overwhelmingly the side that has the lists of books that should not be in libraries. But very often the right will hurl back at the left. Look at what happened with Dr. Seuss. They canceled Dr. Seuss, et cetera. To me, it does not seem analogous for a publisher to decide we're not going to continue new editions of certain books because some of the imagery or messaging is outdated based on current norms. That's very different than here's a list of 20 books that shouldn't even be available in the library. From your perspective, are these two very different things, or are they equivalent the way the right states?
No, I don't think they're equivalent. I think that, and the cases are very slim. The cases that they can point to of alleged suppression of books certainly just don't hold up. The overwhelming majority of challenges to books in schools are coming from conservatives and parents who just don't want their kids or anybody else's kids to have access to books that in many cases are life-saving, because they show LGBT kids that they belong, that they are accepted, and these are very important books, and also how we present our history.
Last thing I want to ask you about, what do you make of the tie between actual issues of suppression of speech by governments and some of the sort of cancel culture, social media, private business discussion that now is going on? Certainly legally, I think at this point, most of us, although some people call me and they don't seem to get this difference, most of us understand that legally, Twitter can have terms of service wherein they don't allow certain types of statements to be made. It's not a First Amendment issue. It has nothing to do with that. That we understand, so we can sort of skip beyond that. But ideologically, and from a principles standpoint, when there is not a legal issue, what would an organization like yours say about some of the terms of service on these social media platforms that do limit the things that are allowed?
Well, we understand the power of social media, and we understand, why the decisions that get made on social media are so important to people. We have an arts advocacy project ourselves to try and push back against algorithms that are banning all nudity, for example, including artistic nudity from social media. But ultimately, we hold with the view that the companies have to be allowed, as is their First Amendment right, to make decisions about what content they allow and don't allow, and unfortunately at this point, there are efforts underway. There are laws that have recently been passed in Texas and in Florida that are trying to force social media companies to accept content that they don't want.
Right.
And that is a step toward government intervention in free speech that we can't allow, that we have to challenge.
Yeah, that's an important point. It's ultimately government intervention either way, and that's a critical point. We've been speaking with Chris Finan, who's the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. The book is How Free Speech Saved Democracy, which we will link to from our YouTube clip for this interview. Chris, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.